Hello and welcome, Conor, to Bitcoin People. A pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me, Carrie.
I came across you, Conor, because recently I clicked on something in Twitter where Jason Lowry was speaking about his thesis that he's about to publish. I think we're at the tail end of the writing process, and he's now about to publish. And he'd spoken at one of your meetups, and you did just an excellent summary of it that made sense of it, because it's quite a complex thesis. There's a lot to it. And so I would love to get an understanding, because as I went down the track of looking at your biography and your background, you've done a lot of work in the Bitcoin space. So I'm going to hand over to you to introduce us to you and what you've been doing, that led you to this point, so historically work-wise, and what you're doing now in this space.
Sure. So just a good old Bitcoin pleb. Love spending time on Bitcoin Twitter. Graduated in 2020, former D3 football player. And when I got a stimulus check in the mail from good old Uncle Sam, I realized something was deeply wrong. So started going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And that led me to go into a bunch of meetups up here in the New England area. Met the guys at Mass Adoption, and since then the rest is history, as they say. I've been trying to orange pill as many people in New England as possible and get them to come experience what Bitcoiners are like in person.
I love that, and that's part of the reason I started the podcast, because I hadn't discovered the meetup in the local area at that stage, and so I literally started the podcast so I could meet Bitcoiners.
That's awesome.
So you said you got the stimulus check and you thought something was wrong when that happened, whereas I think a lot of people felt like that's what the government should do. This is an emergency situation. Of course, they should support folk in need under these circumstances who have lost their jobs or their businesses. Why was your instinct that something was wrong with the stimulus checks?
Yeah, there's a great Thomas Paine quote I tweeted recently that's something along the lines of like, the more challenging the thing you're going through, the greater the triumph. And it's kind of like that short-term pleasure. Like, obviously it was nice getting $1,200 in the mail. It's like, oh, I can buy a bunch of stuff. But I realized, just, basic economics, if they're handing everyone money, there's going to be consequences to these actions later on. And sure enough, it was the worst inflation we've seen since, I believe, the 80s. So I just had kind of a gut feeling there would be a lot of consequences to this. It was a short-term pleasure that was going to lead to a lot of pain down the road.
So many people would say that, oh, they're tightening interest rates now, they're getting inflation under control. Why is this really a problem? That was the short-term pain was the high inflation, and now it's under control and life goes on as usual.
Yeah, I think there's one argument to be made that, like, the CPI number is heavily manipulated. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think there was one stat when inflation was at its worst. If you had taken the measurement from like the 80s for CPI and applied it to the current measurement, it would have been well above 10%. And of course, I think at the highest it got was like 9.1%. And now everyone's like, oh, it's coming down, so it's fine. But we still had inflation, and just because it's now evening off, those prices aren't going to go back down unless we actually have deflation. So it's just it's a very malicious thing. And I think inflation at 2%, I love like the Jeff Booth way of thinking about it, when like if someone walks in your house and they were to steal 2% of the stuff in your house a year, you might not notice it for a long time. But if someone walks in your house and they start stealing around 10% of all the stuff in your house, you're going to notice it pretty quickly. And I think in the West, we've been pretty privileged, especially here in the States, because we have the global reserve currency to be able to export our inflation and not really worry about it. But I think it's become very apparent to a lot of people these past two or 3 years that something is wrong. And just because they're raising interest rates, they've raised them to, I think, somewhere around 4.5% now. And inflation's still well above that. So the idea I'm going to give someone money and they're going to pay me back 4.5% when that money is devaluing, if we believe the number at 6% today, it's just like guaranteeing yourself a loss. And I mean, maybe there's something to be said if you have a super high net worth, and you get that coupon, it's harder to tax that bond. So maybe there's something there I can understand. But nevertheless, for the average person who earns an income, it just makes no sense why you'd lend money unless you were trying to take advantage of that tax type situation, tax avoidance, because you're just guaranteed to lose 1.5% if you believe the government number of 6%, and you're getting 4.5%. And I'd argue there's it's likely a much higher CPI than they're telling us.
No doubt about it. The way they've manipulated that basket of goods and changed it over the years to leave out anything, any high ticket items is insane. So the problem here is that the people who are most likely to be familiar with economics and inflation and are financially literate are the ones who are least affected by inflation. And the people who are most affected are the ones who are just busy trying to pay their bills without the luxury of time to explore the causes of inflation. So in the hope that one person is listening to this who, for whatever reason, has stumbled across this, and this is their first introduction to the idea of what causes inflation and why it's a problem, and then we'll of course explore what we can do about it. How would you explain that in the simplest terms that you can?
In the simplest terms, it's like when there is a set number of goods, so the supply is set, and money is at its most basic form just the thing we use to trade with people when we don't have something they want. So we give them money so they can use that money to buy something else in the future. And when you put more money into the system and you're chasing the same amount of goods, so you don't increase the production, you don't increase the supply of that good, the only natural result is inflation. And not to tie into Bitcoin too quickly, but as far as I can tell, that's the only good that's truly scarce, that's truly fixed at 21 million, that no one, no matter what, can create more of. I think gold is what the free market shows as money. But if we wake up tomorrow and gold's $4,000, you can rest assured that gold miners will increase the production and start trying to pump out more gold to meet that demand because they have a huge incentive to do so. And I think our current financial system is so complex, and you study Keynesian economics and there's all these complex equations and they try and make you feel stupid. But at the end of the day, it just goes back to that. If there's more money chasing the same amount of goods, the natural result is inflation. And Keynesian economists might try and justify it and say, well, we need inflation to stimulate growth. But I'd argue that's just a ridiculous theory.
100%. But that's because I've also read a fair bit about this space. I have had discussions with people, because I'm forever, like all of us, trying to orange pill the people around me. And I had a question recently. So two things that we might get pushback on in what you've just said. One is, well, they can increase gold supply, they can increase the supply of everything. Why are we chasing the same number of goods? They can simply produce more of almost all goods, other than Bitcoin, as you say, but everything else is. So if demand has increased because we've got more money circulating because they printed more money, why don't they just increase supply?
I think it goes back to incentives breaking down. When they print too much money, you have a lot of people who are incentivized to align themselves close to the money printer. So, try and be a quintillionaire, someone who benefits from that freshly printed money, rather than people actually increasing the supply of whatever good or service might bring value to the market. And I think the more central planners you have step in, and the more people who are just trying to rent seek, so not actually provide value, but just be for lack of a better word, just an unnecessary middleman. These supply chains don't get fixed, and people say it's Putin's price hike, or we have supply chain issues, but that's just a direct result of the incentives of the system being broken. And I know some Keynesian economists might say, no, inflation really is necessary to stimulate growth. And savings in a way is bad, because if everyone's saving their money, we're not going to, GDP is not going to increase. I think savings is a good thing. I think people should be incentivized to save. People should not be punished for saving, because that's whether you want to save for a house, a car, whatever it is, you should be able to do so and not worry about your money losing its value rapidly.
Mhm.
But then this idea too that savers aren't going to spend. It's like if your option is hoard money because you think it's going to be worth more in the future, or buy dinner and not starve, any sane person is going to buy the dinner. And I just think we've gotten to the point where it's really nearly impossible to tell the difference between savings and investments, and that's why very wealthy people typically park their wealth in stocks and houses and scarce goods that aren't so easy to make more of, because they know that when they increase the money supply, the price of their assets are going to go up a lot.
And this is one of the things that really bothers me about the current system, is the wealth gap that's created by it. Is that, as you said about the is it Cantillon or Cantillon? How do you pronounce it?
I can't tell you, but I could be wrong on that. I'm not too confident.
I don't know. No, me either. Is that it is the people who are closest to the money printing, basically. So the people at the top end who get most of that, who benefit most from that, who access most of whatever's printed. And so you get your $1,200 stimmy check, and you think that's great, but actually what's happening at the top end all the time is hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars are being siphoned off there, and you get your 1,200. And that's the wealth divide that's created by this system. So let's just talk about incentives then, and why. Let's go further down. Socialism, why that doesn't work, because we've seen it play out across the globe. Wherever there's been socialism or communism that's tried to equal the playing field and minimize that wealth gap through force and through violence, why doesn't it work as a system to create economic growth and wealth equality?
Yeah, I think there's like the famous line. It's like, oh, communism, it's not that it doesn't work, it's just that it's never been implemented correctly.
Yeah.
But the only thing you can really rest assured is that humans are going to interact based on the incentive structure they're placed in. And it seems in a socialist society, the most powerful and the wealthiest are not the ones providing value to others. They're the ones who are rent seeking and trying to get into positions of political power. And in a capitalistic system, as far as I can tell, it seems that you're more incentivized to go out and provide goods and values and legitimate services to the market, rather than trying to rent seek and just get in those powerful positions. And I think we're towing a really scary line here in the United States, talking about just demonizing people who are trying to profit, saying, oh, it's just these greedy profiteers, because profit is what incentivizes someone to go out and produce more of said good. Like with the gold example I gave, they're trying to seek a higher profit, so they're going to try and make more gold, or whatever industry you might be in. And I don't think profit should be something we demonize. The idea that, the American dream, if you will, is being able to come to this country of opportunity and build a life of wealth through yourself by providing value to the market. And the idea that some politician or central planner should just be able to tax you because they have some illegitimate authority, fiat, by decree, is it doesn't serve anyone but that very politician. And when you install a socialist system like that, very few people are incentivized to go and provide legitimate goods and services. It's kind of like when they print money, everyone's trying to be a quintillionaire. In a socialist system, everyone's trying to be at the top and in cahoots with the government so they can benefit from a system that is as far I can't think of any socialist system that's really worked. I mean, it used the CCP, but it's because they have like a capitalist foundation under them, and even then it's they have their own issues and challenges.
People often use Scandinavia as an example of effective socialism. Do you have a view on Scandinavia?
One thing I've heard, and I'm really not an expert on Scandinavia, I need to do some more research, but is that it's a very homogenous population. So a lot of the people are the same, and that allows them to, I think, work well with each other. It's to bring it back to Bitcoin, at a Bitcoin meetup, I see a lot of people, like there's one guy at my local meetup who just gives soap to everyone because he's got like little Bitcoin soap and there's a bee on it and it smells fantastic. It's like such a cool thing, and he does it because he knows Bitcoiners love it. And I've even tried to give the guy some sats for it, and he's like, no, for me, just the fact that you smell good, that's all I needed. But it's like you want to help those who are in your group. It doesn't mean you're xenophobic or you're racist or you hate other people. It's just you want to help those who are like-minded and who you care for. And I think from what I've heard, like I said, I'm not an expert, but I think because of how homogenous it is and how everyone's kind of the same, they've been able to foster a successful socialist environment. And it's not, I mean, that on its face, like, yeah, who wouldn't want to live in a utopia and there's no poverty and everyone's doing great? I just think we need to realize, unless you live in a very homogenous population like that, or you're with a group of people who is very kind and altruistic and want to help the greater good in your society or group, I've yet to see an example of socialism installed successfully that lasts anyways.
And just to add to that, my understanding is Scandinavia has some of the highest debt rates in the world. So how long that can last, I don't know. Okay, so in terms of then adding value and incentive structures, has there ever been a time in the world, and I'm thinking now back to the gold standard, in fact, even before fiat decreed or certificated gold, when it was physical gold and people were trading with gold, that wasn't exactly utopia, and yet the government couldn't print it. So what are your thoughts about, are we going back to something? So if we start exploring a hyper-Bitcoinized world or a Bitcoin standard world, whatever you want to call it, where there's limited supply like there was with gold, and it has to be mined, so there's proof of work like there was with gold. I don't know that we could call medieval times utopian. So what is different about Bitcoin versus gold, other than the fact that it's obviously digital and that it's more transparent and it's more transportable, is the word, portable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Saifedean Ammous did a really good job kind of trying to answer this question in his book, The Fiat Standard. Yeah. And he tried to examine fiat without his biases, which as a Bitcoiner, obviously we all love to hate on fiat currency, but it had a legitimate reason for coming about, because we needed to allow people to trade in a fashion that just wasn't possible with gold. It's hard to transport. There's only so much of it, which isn't, I don't even think it's a problem. There's only so much of it, but it's hard to break gold into littler chunks. And that's kind of why silver came to be, because it was a smaller medium. You're not going to take your gold bar to just buy a sandwich. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin fixes that by being able to, you can divide it 8 digits back. And, there's even argument for smaller transactions than that on the Lightning Network, a fraction of a Satoshi. So the fact that you can trade near instantly, you can verify for yourself. That's the other thing with gold. If you read up on the Roman Empire, they kind of started to collapse after they started clipping the coins, until it got to the point where like there was less than an eighth of the coin was actually made up of gold and the rest was lead. So I mean, how many people are melting down the gold and the verifying? It's a difficult thing with Bitcoin. You have an old laptop, you can verify that the Bitcoin is legitimate on your own server at home without having to trust anyone. So it kind of takes the best of gold with the limited supply and the fact that it's very hard to cheat. And then it also takes the best of fiat, where you have these little paper units that are much easier to trade with people and exchange and barter with, and combines it in this digital thing. And a lot of us are obviously spending time now on Twitter or cyberspace or whatever social media platform we prefer. And with the Bitcoin network, something I know we're planning on talking about later is you can almost kind of secure your bits now. You can, Marty Bentz writes some great articles, and usually I don't pay for a Substack just because there's so many and there's so much content out there to read. But he puts some of his articles behind like a 25-cent Lightning paywall, and I'm much more inclined to send some sats to read an article of his that I like, just because it's instantaneous. I pay the Lightning invoice and I get the article, versus trying to, put in my credit card or debit card so I can pay a $5 monthly fee to someone's Substack, just as an example.
Yeah, indeed. For people who aren't familiar with the payment system and payment process, So, and I want to do a kind of basic recap for folk around self custody. And that can seem, there's a lot of responsibility in self custody, obviously. And also, then it seems scary, the whole idea of paying and what happens if that payment goes astray and I can't get it back. And, you know, that Bitcoin is lost or gone to some strange wallet. And that's that. I've messed up. So, what do you have you got any thoughts around that?
Yeah, my personal way of thinking about it is like once you really go down the rabbit hole, you should get some type of hardware device or consider running a node on your own computer. But when you're just starting, the best thing you could do is just buy a little bit, whether it be at a Strike or a Swan or a River. I think those three companies, because they're Bitcoin only and all the education that comes with them, is very helpful. And then pull it off to like a Moon wallet or a Blue wallet. MUUN is kind of my favorite, and it's just this very simple Bitcoin and Lightning wallet on your phone, and learn how to send some sats and just play around with it, play around with the Lightning network, try and send people. And the way I think about it is like all the Bitcoin stored on a hardware wallet, that would be Bitcoin I considered my savings. Whereas all the Bitcoin stored on my Moon wallet on my phone, which is, you know, my phone's always connected to the internet. So it's a hot wallet, whereas a hardware wallet that holds your private keys is considered a cold wallet because it's not actually connected to the internet. So there's no one to hack in. So, you know, treat it like a checking and a savings account. You know, your checkings for money you're going to spend very quickly, and that's what you should do on your phone. And then your savings account, you know, that's money you're not going to touch. And in some banks, you obviously earn more yield on it. With Bitcoin, you don't earn yield, but you're guaranteed to never have that money debase as long as, you know, nodes and miners keep enforcing the 21 million code. And as far as I can tell, that'll never change, because if that was changed, then the whole incentive of why people hold and store Bitcoin would just come toppling down. So I think the best way to go about it is to kind of treat it like that checkings and savings, and, you know, get yourself comfortable, do some transactions, actually try and pay for something with it, go on Bitrefill if you don't have any people in your area who accept Bitcoin, and try and use the Lightning network. It's, you know, there's no better feeling. And this is another example of, I guess, socialism working. When I'm at a Bitcoin meetup and I tell someone to download Moon Wallet, and then I send them $1 of Bitcoin through the Lightning network just because I want to show them, and there's no KYC, no sign up. And I tell them to try and figure out their, you know, write down their private keys on their own after the fact, don't show anyone, but just to get that dollar instantaneously and realize you don't have to rely on a Venmo or a bank account hooked up to that Venmo, no third parties, just using the Bitcoin network to send that money instantaneously. The reaction on their face is worth way more than that dollar of Bitcoin I sent them. Maybe not in the future if Bitcoin does what we think it's going to do, but I get it. It's such a rewarding experience, and I love seeing that reaction when people get that dollar and realize this system is 100 times better than the old one.
Cool as. I need to be starting to do that with all the merchants in my area, so I'm really pleased you said that. Tell me your vision of a Bitcoin world. What does it look like? And clearly this is not something that happens overnight, and the transition is going to be messy. But if we got through the transition, if this actually happened, first of all, will it actually happen? Do you think it will actually happen? And B, what's your imagination of what it will look like at the other end?
Yeah, unless we have some black swan event. I know nothing is 100% guaranteed, but I just think the incentives of this network are so much better than any other system. And as we talked about a little bit before we started recording, hope, you know, we don't want pain to be the best teacher, but typically pain is the best teacher. And I think as governments push CBDCs and other stuff like that, they're going to wake more and more people up in the same way they woke a bunch of people up when they sent out stimulus checks. And I was listening to Max Kaiser and his wife Stacey Herbert on their Orange Pill podcast recently, and they were talking about how, you know, while the rest of the world kind of falls into plunder, and they gave the example of like in a New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, you're seeing people walk into CVS and walk out with $100 of stuff and just plundering these stores. And their argument was that it's because at the top you see people just essentially plundering on a much larger scale, you know, running up the debt, just total disregard for fiscal responsibility, proposing ideas like printing $1 trillion platinum coin to pay our debts, which is just absolutely insane. And in El Salvador, you're seeing kind of the opposite of all this entropy you're seeing everywhere. In El Salvador, you're seeing this resurgence of a place that had been plundered first by the Spaniards, as they said, and then the Americans, is now starting to build from the ground up. And they're building roads, they're building education centers that offer job opportunities to their people. they're having this grassroots movement to build just a incredible society. As far, I mean, I haven't been yet. I want to get down there at some point, but as far as I can tell from what
I'll
they
meet you
say,
there. I'll meet you at
yeah,
Bitcoin.
right. And I wrote about that in one of my articles. It's amazing how many Bitcoiners have flocked there. There have been so many articles, you know, in the mainstream media about how this experiment failed, yet their GDP was in double digits for the first time. Outside the spot price of Bitcoin, every single metric that you could use to gauge, you know, the overall health of an economy or a society is just doing fantastic in El Salvador. So I think I'm really hopeful that the United States and people like Jason Lowry can help, you know, maybe orange pill the United States, because I want to see more of that here. You know, I think as much as I have qualms with some of the leaders in the United States, I really do love what the Constitution, you know, gave the people of this country, and I want us to go on and thrive. And I worry that I don't see any other way outside of adopting Bitcoin to help the West in general thrive and build a society where people are more concerned with providing value and helping others than plundering. Because, you know, it's like we have mirror neurons. When we see people doing something, we're bound to do it ourselves. You know, if you see the president of the United States just extracting resources and stealing and looting and lying and just lying straight to the people, well, it's likely you're going to pick up on some of those behaviors if the top guy's doing it. Whereas in El Salvador, like Max and Stacey were pointing out, if you see the president working to build roads and build opportunities and build jobs and centers for people to go and work, you know, it motivates the person, you know, at the lowest level of society to maybe not go and steal and maybe actually try and be a productive member of society rather than someone who just plunders. And, you know, I think at least from what I've experienced in Bitcoin meetups, everyone's so hopeful, they're so passionate, they're so excited to build. And when I spend, you know, we all have to spend time in quote unquote fiat world, but when I spend time in that system, you see a lot of nihilism, and it's sad because, you know, I want people to be excited about the future. I don't want them to think that all hope is lost and that it's pointless.
So positive. I heard Max Kaiser on What is Money with Breedlove just in the last couple of days, actually. And he says something about Bitcoin ushers in a new era of human consciousness or something like that. Because imagine a world where you can thrive, where you can follow your passions, where you know you're going to be not only rewarded for work you give or value you put in, but you can then save those rewards and buy stuff with it in the future that you know your savings will outpace the price, and to be able just to exhale, to breathe. I think so many people in our society, we're just all going at 1,000,000 miles an hour and we're on the hamster wheel, and it's just, we can't breathe, we can't create, we can't live our passions, our dreams, we've all got this song inside us, this hidden creativity that needs expression in whatever form, whether it's, I'm talking about creativity like in engineering, and you know, like it doesn't mean creativity like drawing. So I have this world in my mind that comes out of some sort of science fiction like Star Trek or something, you know. So that's what goes through my mind. And to add to that, I think what you've just said about El Salvador, you know, you've said about every metric it's improved. And one of those is reduced crime. There's been massively reduced crime. In fact, I think it's trending towards one of the lowest crime rates in the world now. I may be speaking out of turn there. I may have gotten that wrong, but
That's what it says. It's down 95% or something like that, which, I mean, even if it's not the lowest in the world, that's incredible. It's just a testament to, I think, him adopting Bitcoin and people seeing there's a better, brighter future. And maybe I shouldn't go and loot and plunder and steal if, you know, I'm hopeful for the future. Whereas if you're a nihilist and you just think, none of it matters, like, screw it, who cares if I just go and rob this person? You know, you see, especially when the top levels of society are doing it, it's no surprise that you see it at the bottom levels of society as well.
Yeah, that's precisely right. I mean, who are our examples these days? Who's a leader you actually admire? Or it's really, it's a very difficult world to be living in at the moment. And, you know, I've got a kid, and my hope is that, you know, of course, we leave behind a better world than what we've created since the decoupling from the gold standard, really. But even before that, you know, fractional reserve banking has been in for hundreds of years, from the time that banks existed. You know, they started fractional reserve banking very, very quickly. So speaking of reduced crime rate, then let's go to Jason Lowry's thesis. Let's go to the peace that Bitcoin can create. It makes sense to me, and this is where I've always struggled with Jason Lowry stuff. I get it at the national level, is that if I own my own Bitcoin, the government can't steal it from me, they can't manipulate it, they can't create inflation with it. So it's mine, and the purchasing power increases over time, and they can't put a gun to my head to, you know, they can't threaten me to take it away. I mean, unless literally they'd have to torture me to get the seed phrase out of my head, as it were. So I get that it reduces violence and coercion, let's call it coercion, at the national level. What I've always struggled with is that at the international level, so much violence and war seems to be because of religion and old hurts, different belief systems, or resources. And so one of the things I overheard Michael something anyway recently talking about a big part of Russia's need to invade all those countries on the periphery. Partially it's having a buffer to make them feel safe, but a big part of it is arable land. They don't have a lot of arable land because of the nature of just their geography and their climate. So do you understand, are you able to get into that? Do you have an understanding of Jason's material or your own theories around this as to how it reduces war?
Yeah, I was reading Ray Dalio's The Changing World Order, and I don't necessarily agree with the thesis that China is going to be the next dominant superpower, but obviously I'm biased. I live in the States. But one of the things that I found really interesting is he talked about the Opium Wars and how Britain, the UK, wanted a lot of China's goods, and they were paying silver for it, and they ran out of silver to keep buying stuff from China. So what they do, they started selling opium to the Chinese people in exchange for silver, and then they used that silver to start buying goods, and it led to the fall of the Qing dynasty. And you know, it kind of humiliated China because a big percentage of their population got hooked on opium. And kind of reminds me of what we're seeing on an international geopolitical level. Like, I'm no expert, but I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to, yes, Russia wants that land, but Russia's also tired of these paper promises that the West face no opportunity cost for creating. So, you know, we can snap our fingers, hit a few buttons on a keyboard, update the SQL database held at the Fed, boom, more paper units. And we can use those units to buy actual goods and services from Russia. In this case, obviously, energy, you know, natural gas being the biggest example. And Russia's just kind of calling that bluff, saying, I'm done. And I mean, I'm obviously, I think the biggest losers of this war are the Ukrainian people. It's so unfortunate what they're having to go through, but it's not such a black and white thing. USA, the West, good guys, Russia, bad guy. There's a lot of nuance to this conversation. And while I don't agree with Russia invading Ukraine, I understand why they're upset about us just creating these paper promises and paying them for legitimate goods and services with stuff that we do not face an opportunity cost for creating. So I think Bitcoin helps fix that in a lot of ways, because it's just, you know, the Kremlin can run as many Bitcoin nodes as they want, and the White House can run as many Bitcoin nodes as they want, and they can verify on their own terms. And we can start buying, you know, we don't have to use US dollars, or we don't have to use our US dollars and convert them to Russian rubles to buy goods. We can just use Bitcoin. And, you know, I know a lot of governments want to try and impose CBDCs on their citizens, but I can't imagine many governments are too keen to take another government's CBDCs. So I don't see how on an international level we don't use Bitcoin to cooperate better. And I forget who said the quote. I wish I remembered so I could attribute to them, but it's like, if goods and services don't cross borders, you can rest assured bombs are going to cross borders, something like that. And
Yeah.
it's such an apt point.
Yeah, I read years ago, I think it was George Friedman. I'm gonna get this wrong. And he was saying, wherever there's a McDonald's in the world, there's no war. And it was just that.
It's
It
pretty
was a
good.
case of they were more interested in trade and prosperity and peace and, building businesses than destroying. Yeah, so it's creation versus destruction. There's another point that you've just made there that really triggered a line of thought for me. You were talking about the getting the Chinese people addicted to opium at the time, which my understanding was very much it was a more deliberate strategy than than simply. I hadn't heard that silver thing before. Actually, they ran out of silver. My understanding was actually that they went in deliberately wanting to get the Chinese people addicted. So anyway,
It was probably a bit of both. I'm sure that also factored
all
in.
of that would have factored in all of it. But the issue of addiction is when you also you've talked about people getting fed up or nations getting fed up with the American Reserve, basically, and America being able to manipulate the money at will, but also getting not only themselves, but the whole world addicted to debt, addicted to printing money. And so it's a not dissimilar thing. The same way that the British exported opium, so America has exported debt, and we're all drowning in debt, and there's no way out. There is no way out.
Yeah, it's so vicious because we're at the point where we can't stop printing money because the system will actually collapse in on itself. I mean, I don't see any other system besides Bitcoin that could actually allow deflation to take hold. Because if we stop printing money, all these paper promises are just going to come collapsing in on themselves. And it's horrible because, you know, it's like a drug addict. They have to take more and more of the drug to keep getting that same high. And we're in that exact situation. We have to print more and more money to make the system more stable. And you're seeing these economic cycles come quicker and quicker and quicker because we're kind of reaching the end game. You know, a lot of people said after 2008, done, the system is kaput. Sure enough, they've kicked the can down the road till now. And I'm sure they got some more tricks up their sleeves, but it just seems like at some point, it was one of the titles of my podcast, like Bitcoin is the only system that allows deflation to take hold. And there's no more arguments like, you know, people aren't going to spend any money. It's just if we don't print that money, we are so addicted that the system will collapse in on itself. And it's like pick your poison, hyperinflation or the greater depression. So I don't see another system outside of Bitcoin. Clearly gold has its own issues where every time you back it gets centralized and then people start manipulating and we just get back to fiat currency again. So maybe I'm missing something, but
yeah, no doubt about it. So my concern here is that, first of all, I've been actually thinking about this stuff. This is an amazing situation to be in, but my mother was talking about debt and money printing when I was a kid, and that's a long time ago. And I read a book called The Great Reckoning that she recommended to me when I was in my teens, and that was by Rees-Mogg and Davidson, and that was about the collapse of the West based on exactly these issues. And I was reading that 35 years ago. And here we are 35 years later, and the system's still going. And as you said, we all thought it was going to be over in 2008, and it kept going. And so my question is, most people expect it can keep going and going and going. When or how does collapse happen, do you think?
I think it kind of goes back to that point, like you have a kid and I just had a kid recently and I want to make sure, as I'm sure you do, that, thank you very much, that they have a future that is positive and they can grow up in for lack of a happy world. And I think Jeff Booth, this took me a long time to get, but like this idea that like technology is this deflationary force that's making everything cheaper because the better technology gets, the more goods and services you can produce. I mean, think a tractor's technology. When tractors were created, it was a much more efficient way to create more vegetables or fruit or whatever you're growing than by plowing the field with a horse. Then you have this system that they have to print money, and you get these like this deflationary force butting up against these inflationary forces, and they're fighting each other. I think one thing that's very hard for humans is to understand exponential growth. I might have the numbers wrong, but like if you could fold, if you fold a piece of paper 8 times, it's pretty small. But you can't fold a piece of paper 64 times. But if you could, it would be like the distance from the Earth to the sun, or just something insane like that.
The
And
moon
that's
I've
just
heard, but yeah, yep.
it's just the power of exponential growth. How quickly technology's taken off, and it's so important we allow deflation to happen, because then everyone could benefit from the increased productivity of goods and services created and added to the economy if we let deflation take hold. So I think at some point, I don't know when the system collapses, but at some point it's going to become obvious. And in the old system, the sovereign individual kind of talks about this a little bit, but you got to register as an LLC, and whether you're in the States, maybe you do it in Delaware just because that seems to be the one everyone does it in, or you got to register your business, and then you got to have a storefront. And then now with technology, there's all these online services provided, all these online goods. So you click on Amazon and you check out. And Bitcoin's going to make that even easier, where, say you're a content creator, you can start putting your podcast behind a paywall that costs 10 sats. And that's, as of today, maybe not in the future, but as of today, 10 sats is a fraction of a penny. Most Bitcoiners are like, yeah, 10 sats, whatever, gladly pay that. So just the ways it's going to allow people to trade, to offer goods and services, to interact. I use through Strike, I bought coffee beans from El Salvador from just some random vendor who was offering his services online. And if I didn't have, something like Bitcoin to do that, I can't Venmo someone in El Salvador. Venmo works great in the States, but I can't, send them a Venmo. But I could deposit US dollars into Strike, and then Strike takes care of everything on the back end, and that person in El Salvador receives that Bitcoin. I just think we can't even begin to imagine the goods and services that are going to come from it. And I'm hopeful Bitcoin can help prevent this, system collapse, because fiat currency has been an experiment. And I think a lot of people don't realize it's been an experiment, but the system is propped up by IOUs. And Janet Yellen recently said that the U.S. has never defaulted on its debt, which is a whole nother conversation to lie. But she said that the U.S. Treasury security is the safest investment on the planet. And that's just kind of, I know a lot of people in Wall Street think that way, but that's kind of insane that an IOU that is $31.4 trillion in the hole is supposed to be the safest investment on the planet. I think Bitcoin's a safer investment. I mean, as far as I can tell, I can, go verify on the node in my living room and make sure that there's only 21 million, and make sure that no one can debase that, and live in a system that is just not, a system backed by essentially debt. So IOUs and violence, the full force of the United States government.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a thought around that, and then I lost track of it. Isn't that funny? I do think that. So I do see it unraveling. I know what it was. I remember Greg Foss saying the US dollars are going to be what was it? Oh, US dollars are the fastest horse in the glue factory.
I cried when I first heard that quote. That was so good. The cleanest shirt in a pile of dirty shirts. She's got so many good ones like that.
Totally. So here's the thing, though. I would say, we're a very small percentage of Western civilization. Certainly there's good uptake and understanding, as again we were talking about just prior to the podcast, there's a lot of countries that get it. So Venezuela gets it. They've had hyperinflation. Parts of Ukraine get it because they've needed to get out of town and take money with them, and you can't do that with gold or fiat that's then tradable, particularly in the Ukrainian local currency. Nigeria, Zimbabwe, there are places that kind of really get this, but very few people in the West. It's a relatively small percentage of the population, and it feels like I suppose it feels not dissimilar to COVID and lockdowns and vaccines. It feels like the people, I don't know if this is true, the people who were concerned about the lockdowns and the consequences of lockdowns, so as you were worried about the consequences of stimmy checks, and the people who were concerned about vaccine mandates, are the people who are most likely to be drawn towards Bitcoin or see the value proposition in Bitcoin. Whereas the vast majority, certainly where I live in Melbourne, Australia, have just re-elected the government that imposed the worst lockdowns on the face of the earth, other than China, and obviously mandates, but that was largely across the world. I don't know that people are going to see the value proposition in this.
Yeah, I kind of touched on it in one of my articles, this idea that the states who are going to get it are the ones who desperately need it. And
Yeah,
I think you're
so it
right.
really is
It's
bottom up. Yeah.
yeah, and it's tough because I mean there's a lot of people in Western society who are in the lower rungs who really need something like this to save and store their wealth because they just don't hold the assets. So and when the money printer spins back up, inevitably, like it, we know they're addicted to debt, so they're going to spin the money printer back up. They're probably going to opt for hyperinflation over the Greater Depression. It's important to try and teach these people they hold Bitcoin. And yeah, it's pretty wild to see what what we've been through the past 3 years, and it's just the amount of lies. And I'm not exactly sure how I feel about Elon Musk, but at least I appreciate the fact he released the Twitter files, and some of this is coming to light. And what's that? But it's like the truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it; it'll set itself free. And I think these less developed countries are going to start adopting it, and you're going to see these resurgences. You're going to see these phoenixes rise from the ashes, like El Salvador. And I don't want to leave Western society. I love the United States, but I mean, I'm sure there's a point where I'd be like, all right, you know what? I'm putting all my wealth, I'm keeping it in my head, and I'm getting on a plane ticket to El Salvador or Mexico or some other country that isn't going to take away my basic freedoms to enforce some arbitrary rules that they clearly didn't have the science or data to back up, unless they censored and manipulated the information and ran what in hindsight seems to be the biggest psychological operation the earth has ever seen. These tools allow for exponential growth, make it so people can offer goods and services. Anyone can spin up a Bitcoin wallet and offer, so you don't even have to buy Bitcoin. You can spin up a wallet and start accepting Bitcoin for whatever your good and services. I mean, try getting a bank account, if you don't have it's difficult. You got to at least have a driver's license or certain requirements to be able to come in. And now anyone in the world can just spin up a Bitcoin wallet and offer goods and services. But these same tools have obviously, social media and stuff like that have been used to manipulate and kind of coerce people to think some ridiculous things. And it's just important we don't get into these echo chambers, because as much as I love Bitcoin Twitter, I also do try and listen to what other people say. And I listen to Peter Schiff. It kind of drives me crazy, because like he clearly gets it and gets the problems.
Yes.
And we disagree on the solutions. But I think it's important to listen to those people. And even when I roll my eyes when he starts bashing on Bitcoin, I think it's just good to try and get outside that echo chamber, because while some echo chambers are better than others, no echo chamber is perfect. Even Bitcoiners, as much as I love this space.
Well, look, it was interesting because I've remembered the name now. Michael Schillinger was his name, and he was speaking on, it might have been Peter McCormack, I'm not sure. And he was, oh no, it was Joe Rogan. And he was saying, he was the one who talked about Russia and needing those countries as borders, but also the arable land, etc. But then he started talking about Bitcoin later in the conversation, absolutely smashed it, and went down the Balaji, like, because of the sovereign individual kind of idea, the nation states, and breaking up of the idea of nation states and creating more like online nations. And so he just went, there are people like me out there who will just fight tooth and nail against this thing. It's just ridiculous. And my concern is that if we all flock to somewhere like El Salvador or Mexico that gives us those freedoms, that at the end of the day, US just has bigger armaments, and it could get really ugly.
It could, if you read Atlas Shrugged, it's like everyone had the best in society had to retreat to the middle of nowhere in Colorado. But I also think it's one of these things that they kind of eat itself from within. It's like if they can only pay people for so long to enforce their rules. And I really like Michael Malice a lot, and I was listening to him. I think it was either Lex Friedman podcast or the Modern Wisdom podcast with, I forget the guy's name, Chris or something. And he was just talking about how everyone thought the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union was this like force that could never fall. And then one day I think they actually, like, the Soviets ordered, yeah, they ordered a hit, and they said, hey, roll the tanks and crush these protesters. And at some point, these military chiefs just said, no, I'm not doing it. I refuse to kill these innocent civilians. And then the Berlin Wall fell, and people were dancing on it, and it just, like, something that no one ever saw coming. Just was this incredibly hopeful and sincere situation, and the Soviet Union fell, and then sure enough, I actually read the book. My mom met the guy who worked at McDonald's, who brought McDonald's to Russia, and he gave her a book about, like, he wrote a book about it. And I remember reading his book and just how, the process of bringing McDonald's to Russia. And it was not an easy thing to do, but it was so cool to see that process. And Russia opened up, and I know we're, now the West is fighting Russia again, but for a long time it seemed, and I really don't know my Russian history, but it seemed like Russia benefited a lot. They fared a lot better after the fall of the Soviet Union than they did during the Soviet Union. And trade opened up, and it was so exciting. And I don't want to see the West collapse, but if we don't embrace Bitcoin, I think we're kind of looking at the same thing, where the West is this giant, military industrial complex. But at some point, you can only pay people with paper promises for so long to enforce your will. And if enough people leave, the system kind of collapses in on itself. And I'm praying for a future where, the military leaders, if they're told to go bomb Mexico or El Salvador because those people are doing too good, that these leaders just simply refuse and say, no, I'm not going to go bomb these productive people just because, you, the unproductive class, want to go and kill innocent civilians because they're not giving into your gimmicky games and paying. I mean, it's just so ironic that we as a nation, the United States, came to be because we didn't want taxation without representation. Yep. And nowadays, I mean, if you just look at the income taxes, especially in places like California, New York, it's crazy.
And as I was talking about with a friend, it's not just the income taxes. It's we've got capital gains tax, GST, which is goods and services tax. I think you've got a VAT or something. Yeah, it's
inheritance tax,
taxes, inheritance tax, you name it. And when you add them all up, you're devoting like 60-70% of your working hours to just paying taxes. You get the 30% that's left over, and you've got to live on that and supposedly save on that. And then you've got inflation, which is another tax in its own right on the little bit that you've got left.
Yeah. That's when negative yielding bonds start looking pretty good, because you're like, well, it's harder to tax that. No federal income tax on these negative yielding bonds.
It's just
sad to say, but that's where the system is at today.
You've got to laugh, don't you? You've just got to laugh when you cry. Yeah. Like, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. And look, this is feeling like, I really like the kind of hopeful note of kind of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of trade in Russia. Is there something, I know we haven't really touched on meetups, and I know that's something you're really passionate about at the moment. Is there something that you'd really like to expand on here that we haven't had a chance to really you were hoping to speak about, or that you'd like to get out there, or that you just want to, say to the world?
I just tell people, download Moon Wallet, MUUN, in the App Store. I think it's on iOS and Android. Start testing it, play with Bitcoin, get comfortable with it, leg into the trade. Don't just smash by a substantial amount. Start small, learn the network, and then go and meet other Bitcoiners in the wild. Someone brought this quote up at one of our Bitcoin dinners, and it's an Odell quote, and it's like, I'm bullish on Bitcoin, but I'm more bullish on Bitcoiners. And there's just so much truth in that statement. Meeting these people in real life, it's such a stark contrast from what you see in the typical 9-to-5 office job. I mean, I get it, people got to make a living. I'm not trying to crap on the 9-to-5 office job, but it's just such a stark difference from what you see in that versus what you see at a Bitcoin meetup, and the hope and the energy and excitement. So I just encourage people to go and check out their local Bitcoin meetup. I think there's a Swan's got some website that's like Bitcoiner events. Google that. And if you're in the New England area, or if you ever come to the States, check us out at massadoption.net. We'd love to have more people come to the meetup.
Absolutely gorgeous. That's a fantastic note to finish up on. Will I see you, by the way, at the Miami Bitcoin conference? Are you heading to Miami?
I'd love to get down there. With the newborn, it might be tough this year, but I do have plans to get there at some point in the future. And I appreciate you having me on. It's always great chatting about Bitcoin.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here with us, and thanks for your insights and understanding. Great to have you here. All the best. Cheers for now.